Picture this. An old man in ancient Mesopotamia sits by a fire telling his grandchildren a story his grandfather told him. A story about the world before, when the waters rose and swallowed everything. The mountains disappeared beneath angry seas. The sky and ocean became one. Only a single family survived in a great boat carrying animals 2 by 2, waiting for the dove to return with news that land had emerged again. Now jump across the world. A grandmother in the Andes Mountains tells the same story. Different language, different gods, but the same terror. The waters came. Everything drowned. A few people escaped to the highest peaks with their llamas and dogs. They watched their entire world disappear beneath the flood. Jump again. An elder in the Pacific Northwest, then India, then China, then Greece, then Aboriginal Australia. Over and over and over, the same story. A great flood. Nearly everyone dies. A handful of survivors. The world remade. This isn't coincidence. This is memory. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's literally why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I check comments and it's like Tokyo at lunch, Toronto at midnight, all at once. The weirdest thing is seeing how the same human story connects us all across time zones and continents. Kind of like these flood myths. See, there are over 200 cultures around the world, on every inhabited continent, that have flood myths. Not just any flood stories. The same flood story. The details are so similar it's genuinely unsettling. A catastrophic deluge that covers the earth. Divine warning given to a chosen few. People and animals saved in a boat or by climbing to mountain tops. The waters recede. Humanity starts over. For centuries, scholars assumed these were just myths, universal stories that primitive peoples invented to explain scary natural disasters. Floods happen, right? Rivers overflow. Tsunamis hit coastlines. Ancient people experienced these events and exaggerated them into world-ending catastrophes. Makes sense, except it doesn't. Because the flood myths aren't describing rivers overflowing. They're describing something much bigger, much more specific. And here's where it gets weird. They're describing the exact same event. The Greek myth says the flood lasted 9 days and 9 nights. The Mesopotamian version says 7 days and 7 nights. The Chinese flood myth talks about waters that wouldn't recede for generations. The Aztec legend describes 4 previous worlds, all destroyed by floods. Native American tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Plains all have flood stories featuring the same basic elements. Rising seas, drowning lands, desperate survivors, a world that was lost. You know that feeling when you hear a song and can't remember where you learned it, but somehow you know all the words. That's what these flood myths are. Humanity singing the same song without knowing why we all know the lyrics. For most of modern history, scientists dismiss these myths as religious fiction, superstition, primitive attempts to understand a chaotic world. The biblical story of Noah's Ark was just that, a story, a moral lesson about obedience and faith, not a historical record. Then we started finding the evidence. Around 11,600 years ago, something happened to Earth that was so catastrophic, so world-changing, that it literally ended an entire geological epoch. The Pleistocene Ice Age, which had lasted for 2.6 million years, came to a sudden, violent end. And when I say sudden, I mean in terms that would have been visible within a human lifetime. Sea levels rose by 400 feet, not over millions of years, over centuries, in some places over decades. Think about that. 400 feet. That's a 40-story building. Imagine standing on a coastline and watching the ocean rise higher than a skyscraper, watching it swallow river valleys and coastal plains and islands and entire landscapes where your ancestors had lived for thousands of generations. This wasn't a myth. This was geology. This was real. This happened, and people were there to see it. Scientists now call this period Meltwater Pulse 1b, which is a very boring name for the most dramatic climate event in human history. Massive ice sheets that covered North America and Europe, some over 2 miles thick, began collapsing. The water had to go somewhere. It went into the oceans. But here's the thing that will keep you up tonight, or put you to sleep if that's what you're here for. The flood myths don't just describe rising seas generally. They describe specific details that match exactly what we now know happened geologically. The speed of the flooding, the violence of it, the way it transformed coastlines, the fact that it came in pulses, waves of rising water separated by periods of stability. The myths remembered. For 11,000 years, humans passed down stories of the world before the flood, stories of lost lands and drowned cities and coastlines that vanished beneath the waves, and we thought they were making it up. They weren't. So here's what we're going to explore. What really happened 11,600 years ago? What caused the ice to melt so catastrophically? Where did all that water go? And most importantly, what was it like for the humans who lived through it? The people who watched their world drown and somehow survived to tell the story. Because that story, the one that's been passed down through 400 generations, preserved in myths and legends and campfire tales across every culture on Earth, turns out to be true. The Great Flood myths were real, and the evidence is written in stone, in sediment, in the bones of drowned animals, and in the DNA of every human alive today. Let's find out what actually happened. Let's start with the oldest written story in human history, not just one of the oldest. The actual oldest. The Epic of Gilgamesh carved into clay. Tablets in ancient Mesopotamia around 4,000 years ago. But the story it tells is far older, passed down through generations of oral tradition before anyone thought to write it down. In the epic, a character named Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh about the time the gods decided to destroy humanity with a great flood. One god, Ea, warned Utnapishtim in secret. He told him to tear down his house and build a boat. Not just any boat. A massive vessel with specific dimensions. 7 stories tall, divided into 9 compartments, sealed with pitch inside and out. Utnapishtim was instructed to bring aboard his family, craftsmen to preserve human knowledge, and the seed of all living creatures. The flood came. For 6 days and 7 nights the waters rose. The storm was so violent that even the gods cowered in fear. Everything was destroyed. Every human outside the boat drowned. When the waters finally subsided, the boat came to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim sent out birds to search for dry land. First a dove, which returned. Then a swallow, which also returned. Finally a raven, which didn't come back, indicating the waters had receded enough for life to continue. If this sounds familiar, it should. This story predates the biblical account of Noah's Ark by at least 1,000 years, possibly much longer. But here's what's really interesting. The Epic of Gilgamesh wasn't unique even in its own time. Archaeologists have found at least 3 other Mesopotamian flood narratives that are even older. The Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis Epic, the Sumerian King List, all describing the same basic event. A catastrophic flood. A warning from the gods. A boat builder who saves his family and animals. A mountain refuge where life begins again. These weren't copies of each other. They were independent tellings of what people believed was actual history. Ancient Mesopotamians talked about the flood the way we talk about World War II, as a real event that had shaped their world and defined their civilization. They even dated their history in relation to it. Kings were described as ruling before the flood or after the flood, as if the deluge marked the fundamental dividing line in human history. Now you might think this is just regional storytelling. One culture's mythology spreading through the ancient Near East, except the same story appears everywhere. And we're not talking about similar themes. We're talking about nearly identical narratives from cultures that had no contact with each other, no trade routes, no shared ancestry, no possible way to have influenced each other's myths. Take ancient Greece. The Greeks had their own flood story, completely independent of Mesopotamian sources. In their version, Zeus decided to destroy humanity because of our wickedness. But Prometheus, the titan who had given humans fire, warned his son Deucalion. He told him to build a chest, essentially a boat, and stock it with provisions. Deucalion brought his wife Pyrrha, and together they rode out the flood that drowned the entire world. For 9 days and 9 nights the waters rose. Everything was destroyed. When the flood finally subsided, Deucalion's chest came to rest on Mount Parnassus. The couple emerged to find themselves alone, the only survivors in a dead world. They consulted an oracle about how to repopulate the earth, and were told to throw the bones of their mother behind them. They interpreted this to mean stones, the bones of Mother Earth. Each stone Deucalion threw became a man. Each stone Pyrrha threw became a woman. Humanity was reborn. The parallels to the Mesopotamian accounts are striking. The divine decision to destroy humanity, the warning to a righteous man, the boat, the complete destruction of all other humans, the mountain refuge, even the detail about birds. Greek sources mention Deucalion sending out a dove to search for land, exactly like Utnapishtim and Noah, but it gets stranger. Cross the globe to the Indian subcontinent. Hindu texts, particularly the Satapatha Brahmana, which dates back at least 3,000 years, tell the story of Manu. According to the narrative, Manu was washing his hands in a river when a small fish asked for his protection. Manu cared for the fish, which grew to enormous size. The fish, actually the god Vishnu in disguise, warned Manu that a great flood would soon destroy all life on earth. Vishnu told Manu to build a large boat and gather the 7 sages, seeds of all plants and pairs of all animals. When the flood came, the waters rose until they covered even the highest mountains. Vishnu, in his fish form, pulled Manu's boat to safety, towing it to the northern mountains where it finally came to rest. Manu alone survived to become the progenitor of the next human civilization. Again, the same essential elements. Warning, boat, animals, total destruction, mountain refuge, restart of civilization. The Hindu tradition had no contact with Mesopotamian or Greek cultures when these stories were first being told, yet the narratives are remarkably similar. Move to the Americas, this is where it gets really interesting. Because if these were just stories spreading along trade routes from a single source, they shouldn't appear in the New World. The Americas were isolated from Eurasia and Africa for at least 12,000 years. Any flood myths in the Americas had to have developed completely independently, and yet they're everywhere. More than 200 Native American tribes have flood narratives, not vague stories about big rains, but detailed accounts of world-destroying deluges that killed nearly everyone. The Ojibwe people of the Great Lakes region tell of a time when the entire world was covered with water. Only Wainabuzu and a few animals survived by floating on a log. Wainabuzu sent animals diving to find Earth from the bottom. The muskrat finally succeeded, bringing up a paw-full of mud that Wainabuzu used to recreate the land. This story has been passed down for countless generations, long before any contact with European missionaries who might have brought biblical flood narratives. The Lakota have a similar account. In their tradition, a great flood covered the earth. A few people and animals took refuge on a high mountain, but the waters kept rising. They survived by clinging to the peak until the waters finally receded. The Lakota maintain this isn't mythology, but actual history passed down from their ancestors who experienced it. On the Pacific coast, the Haida people tell of a time when the ocean suddenly rose, swallowing the land. People fled to the mountains, some surviving by lashing their canoes to the peaks. When the waters fell, they found a transformed world where the coastline had completely changed. What's remarkable about the Haida account is its specificity. They describe which islands used to be mountains and which valleys are now underwater. It reads less like myth and more like eyewitness testimony preserved across generations. Across the Pacific to Australia, the Aboriginal peoples have maintained oral traditions for at least 50,000 years, possibly the longest continuous cultural memory on Earth. And many of these traditions include detailed flood narratives, not mystical stories, but what researchers call geomyths, oral histories that preserve actual geological events. The Gunditj Mara people of southeastern Australia tell of a time when the sea level was much lower and their ancestors could walk to what are now islands. Then came a great flooding that drowned the coastal plains and separated the islands forever. The Yolngu people of northern Australia have similar accounts, describing lands now underwater, where their ancestors once hunted kangaroos and gathered plants. What's striking about these Aboriginal accounts is their geographic precision. In the 1990s, researchers started comparing Aboriginal flood stories to scientific reconstructions of post-Ice Age sea level rise. They matched. Stories describing specific bays, islands and coastal features that are now underwater aligned perfectly with what sonar mapping showed was there 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, before rising seas flooded the continental shelf. The Aboriginal people weren't just remembering floods, they were remembering the actual coastline before the floods, passing down precise geographic information for over 10,000 years through oral tradition alone. Now jump back across the Pacific to China. Chinese mythology includes multiple flood narratives, but the most detailed is the story of Gun and Yu. According to ancient texts, during the reign of Emperor Yao, a catastrophic flood devastated China. Waters rose so high that they threatened to destroy all of civilization. Mountains were engulfed. Plains became seas. People fled to the hills, struggling to survive. Emperor Yao appointed Gun to control the floods. Gun tried to dam the waters, but failed and was executed for his failure. His son Yu took a different approach. Instead of fighting the flood, he dredged channels to direct the waters safely to the sea. It took Yu 13 years of constant work, but he succeeded, draining the floodwaters and making the land habitable again. What's fascinating about the Chinese version is that it's presented not as myth, but as historical fact. Ancient Chinese historians dated the Great Flood to around 1920 BCE and treated it as a defining moment in their civilization's history. Modern archaeologists were skeptical, dismissing it as legend. Until 2016, when geological evidence of a massive flood on the Yellow River, dating to approximately 19 to 20 BCE, was published in Science magazine. The myth had a basis in actual catastrophic flooding. Travel to Mesoamerica. The Aztecs had detailed flood narratives recorded in their codices and repeated by Spanish chroniclers after the conquest. According to Aztec mythology, the world had been destroyed and recreated 4 times. The 4th world, the one before the current age, was destroyed by a great flood. The god Tezcatlipoca warned a man named Tata and his wife Nene. He told them to hollow out a great cypress tree and take refuge inside it with enough corn for the flood's duration. The waters rose, everything was destroyed, mountains were submerged, all humans drowned except those in the tree. When the floods receded, Tata and Nene emerged, caught a fish, and lit a fire to cook it. This angered the gods, who had forbidden fire. As punishment, they were transformed into dogs. But from their descendants, humanity was eventually reborn. The Maya had similar accounts. The Popol Vuh, the Mayan creation text, describes how the gods created several versions of humanity, destroying each when they proved unsatisfactory. One destruction came by flood. Great rains fell from the sky while resin fell from the earth. The world was darkened and a black rain fell day and night. Humans tried to escape by climbing to the rooftops, but the houses collapsed. They climbed trees, but the trees threw them off. They tried to hide in caves, but the caves closed before them. Almost all were destroyed. Only a few survived to become the ancestors of the current human race. What's remarkable is that the Maya, like the Chinese, treated this as history rather than pure mythology. They maintained elaborate calendars that dated events in relation to the flood. It was their marker of when the current world age began. So here we have cultures separated by oceans and millennia, with no possible contact, all telling essentially the same story. A catastrophic flood that destroyed most of humanity. A warning given to the righteous. Survivors who took refuge in boats or on mountains. Animals saved. A world that had to be rebuilt from scratch. These aren't vague thematic similarities. They're specific narrative parallels that appear again and again. The skeptical explanation has always been that floods are common, so flood stories are common. Every culture experiences flooding at some point, so every culture invents flood myths. But that doesn't explain the specificity of the parallels. Why do so many cultures specify that the flood covered the highest mountains? Why do so many include the detail about sending out birds? Why do so many describe the flood lasting for days or weeks rather than months or years? Why do almost all of them insist this happened to their actual ancestors and marked a restart of civilization? The alternative explanation is much simpler. They're all remembering the same event. Not exactly the same way, filtered through thousands of years of cultural evolution, religious reinterpretation, and oral transmission. But at their core, all these stories preserve the memory of something real, something catastrophic, something that happened to actual humans who survived and passed down the story to their descendants. Think about what it would take for a story to survive for 10,000 years. It can't just be entertaining. It has to be important, critical, the kind of story that parents tell children with absolute seriousness because it contains survival information too important to forget. The kind of story that defines who you are and where you came from. The kind of story that explains why the world looks the way it does and why your people live where they live. That's what these flood narratives are. They're not entertainment. They're not religious parables invented to teach moral lessons. They're cultural memory. Distorted by time, yes. Mythologized, certainly. But rooted in actual events that were so traumatic, so world-altering, that humans couldn't forget them even across hundreds of generations. The common elements point to common experiences. The warning suggests people saw signs before the worst hit. Changes in animal behaviour, unusual tides, strange atmospheric conditions. Our ancestors weren't stupid. They were keen observers of their environment. They would have noticed something was wrong before the catastrophe struck. The boats and mountain refuges suggest people actually used these survival strategies. Some groups had watercraft they could use. Others fled to high ground. Both approaches worked well enough that survivors could pass down the strategy to future generations. The detail about animals suggests people did try to save livestock, and possibly even wild animals. This makes sense. Domesticated animals represented survival resources too valuable to abandon, and in the chaos of rising waters, wild animals would have sought the same high ground as humans, creating the kind of interspecies survival cooperation that would have been memorable enough to preserve in story. The insistence that almost everyone died except a few survivors suggests the real event was catastrophically deadly. Not just a big flood that people rebuilt from, but something that genuinely came close to ending human civilization in the affected regions. The kind of disaster that leaves deep scars in collective memory. And the universal theme of civilization restarting after the flood suggests the real event did mark a genuine discontinuity, a before and after so dramatic that it functioned as year zero for the cultures that survived it. We're not talking about routine seasonal flooding here. We're talking about something that fundamentally changed the world those people lived in. So what actually happened? That's where the science comes in. Because in the last few decades, researchers have figured out that there was a real event, a genuine catastrophe about 11,000 years ago that would have caused exactly the kind of worldwide flooding these myths describe. And it wasn't just bad weather. It was the end of the last ice age, the greatest environmental transformation in human history, an event so catastrophic it drowned entire continents and reshaped the world forever. But before we get to the science, we need to understand just how much was lost. Because these flood myths aren't just remembering water, they're remembering a world that existed before the flood, a world that was completely different from the one we live in now, a world that was in many places better, more resources, more land, more opportunities, and then it vanished beneath the waves, taking with it not just coastlines, but entire civilizations we're only now beginning to rediscover. So what actually happened 11,000 years ago? What was the real event behind all those flood myths that spread across every inhabited continent? The answer is written in ice cores, sediment layers, and the drowned coastlines of ancient civilizations. And it's more dramatic than anything in the myths themselves. We need to go back a bit further first. To understand the flood, you have to understand what came before it. Around 115,000 years ago, Earth entered what geologists call the last glacial period. The Ice Age. Global temperatures dropped. Snow accumulated year after year in the far north and south. That snow compressed into ice, then into massive glaciers that began spreading across the continents. It happened slowly at first, then faster. Within 10,000 years, ice sheets miles thick covered Canada, the northern United States, Scandinavia and northern Europe. The Laurentide ice sheet alone, spanning North America, contained enough frozen water to lower global sea levels by nearly 400 feet. The coastlines we know today simply didn't exist. What's now underwater continental shelf was dry land. The English Channel was a river valley. Indonesia and Malaysia were connected by grasslands. You could walk from Asia to Australia through a landscape that's now hundreds of feet beneath the ocean. This was the world humans knew for over 100,000 years. Cold, dry, with vast ice sheets dominating the northern latitudes. Our ancestors adapted. They learned to hunt mammoth and woolly rhino. They developed sophisticated cold weather clothing. They created social structures that could survive brutal winters. This wasn't some temporary challenge. This was normal. Generation after generation of humans lived and died knowing nothing but Ice Age conditions. Then, around 14,700 years ago, something changed. Global temperatures began rising rapidly. The glaciers started melting. This is what geologists call the Bulling-Allerud warming period. Within a few centuries, temperatures jumped dramatically. Ice that had been stable for tens of thousands of years began to destabilize. Meltwater started flowing in quantities that would make the Amazon look like a stream. Sea levels began rising, not all at once, but fast enough that human communities living on coastlines would have noticed within a single lifetime, maybe a few inches per year. Doesn't sound like much, but compound that over decades. Beaches that grandparents remembered from childhood were now hundreds of feet offshore. River valleys were becoming estuaries. Freshwater sources were turning brackish as the ocean encroached inland. The melting created what climatologists call meltwater pulses. Sudden, catastrophic releases of water that would dwarf any modern flood event. Imagine Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario combined. Now imagine all that water released into the ocean in a matter of weeks or months. That's the scale we're talking about. And it happened multiple times. These weren't just floods in the sense we understand them today. They were reorganizations of entire ocean systems. The sudden influx of cold, fresh water disrupted ocean currents that had been stable for millennia. The Gulf Stream, which carries warm water from the tropics to northern Europe, weakened or shut down entirely during some pulses. This triggered feedback effects that caused regional temperature swings of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius within decades. But just when it seemed Earth was warming into a new stable state, something happened that changed everything. Around 12,900 years ago, the warming stopped dead. Temperatures plunged back toward Ice Age conditions almost overnight in geological terms. Within a few decades at most, possibly within years, the climate reversed course entirely. This is what scientists call the Younger Dryas period, named after an Arctic flower that suddenly reappeared in European pollen records, indicating the return of Ice Age vegetation. It lasted about 200 years, a brief return to glacial conditions right in the middle of the warming trend, and nobody is entirely sure what caused it. The traditional explanation goes like this. As the Laurentide ice sheet melted, meltwater accumulated behind ice dams in what's now central Canada. Massive glacial lakes formed, some of them larger than the Great Lakes. The biggest was Lake Agassiz, which at its maximum extent covered more area than all the current Great Lakes combined. These lakes were held back by walls of ice. As the climate warmed, those ice dams weakened. Then, catastrophically, they failed. Billions of tons of fresh water suddenly poured into the North Atlantic. The cold, fresh water was less dense than normal seawater, so it floated on top. This disrupted the thermohaline circulation, the conveyor belt of ocean currents that moves heat around the planet. When the Gulf Stream shut down, Europe and North America lost their primary heat source. Temperatures crashed. Glaciers that had been retreating began advancing again. The warming stopped. Ice Age conditions returned for over a millennium. This hypothesis is called the meltwater pulse theory, and it's supported by substantial geological evidence. Sediment cores from the North Atlantic show layers of debris that could only have been deposited by massive freshwater floods. Geologists have mapped the channels carved by catastrophic drainage events across Canada and the northern United States. These aren't normal river valleys. They're scablands, landscapes torn apart by water moving with enough force to carve bedrock. The channeled scablands in Washington state show what these floods could do. Geologist J. Harlan Brett spent decades in the early 20th century trying to convince skeptics that these features were created by catastrophic flooding, not gradual erosion. He was eventually proven right. The landscape shows unmistakable evidence of water flows that would have made Niagara Falls look like a leaky faucet. Boulders the size of houses transported hundreds of miles. Dry waterfalls carved into solid basalt. Gravel bars 200 feet high formed by water moving faster than a freight train. If this happened in Washington, it happened elsewhere too. Probably multiple times as different ice dams failed in sequence. Each failure would have created a surge of meltwater that travelled through whatever drainage system existed, gathering strength, eroding channels, and eventually reaching the ocean where it would have created localised but devastating floods along coastlines. But here's where it gets controversial. Some researchers think the meltwater pulse theory doesn't explain everything. The climate reversal at the start of the Younger Dryas was too abrupt, too synchronized across the planet. A meltwater pulse into the North Atlantic might explain European and North American cooling. But the Younger Dryas shows up in climate records from South America, Africa, and Asia too. How do you get global synchronous cooling from a regional flood event? This question led some scientists down a different path. What if something extraterrestrial triggered the Younger Dryas? In 2007, a team of researchers proposed the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. They suggested that around 12,900 years ago, Earth was struck by a comet or asteroid. Not a single large object, but a fragmented body that exploded in the atmosphere and scattered debris across multiple continents. The evidence they point to is tantalizing. At sites across North America, Europe and Asia, there's a distinct layer of sediment dating to exactly the start of the Younger Dryas. This layer contains high concentrations of materials that shouldn't be there, nanodiamonds, which form under extreme pressure and temperature, magnetic spherules, tiny balls of melted rock, carbon spherules from massive wildfires, iridium and platinum, elements rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets, high-temperature glass particles that could only form in extreme heat events. The hypothesis suggests that a comet fragment may be a piece of debris from a larger body that had broken up earlier, entered Earth's atmosphere and exploded above the ice sheets covering North America. The airbursts, think Tunguska event, but multiplied by hundreds, generated enough heat to instantly vaporize massive amounts of ice. The explosions triggered wildfires across entire continents. The sudden injection of water vapor and debris into the atmosphere disrupted climate patterns globally. Most dramatically, the impacts might have destabilized the ice sheets directly, not through gradual warming, but through sudden catastrophic melting from the top down. Billions of tons of ice turned to water and vapor within days or weeks. This could explain why the Younger Dryas boundary shows evidence of sudden, synchronous environmental changes across the entire planet. The hypothesis is controversial. Many geologists argue that the evidence can be explained by terrestrial processes. Wildfires happen naturally. Nanodiamonds can form in other ways. The sediment layer might just be coincidental. The debate continues, with new evidence emerging regularly on both sides. But here's what both sides agree on. Something dramatic happened 12,900 years ago. The climate reversed course suddenly. Ice sheets that had been steadily melting became unstable, and massive amounts of water were released into the ocean in a geologically brief time period. Whether that happened through gradual ice dam failures over centuries, or through catastrophic impact-triggered melting over weeks, the result was the same. The coastlines of the world were drowning. The Younger Dryas lasted until about 11,700 years ago. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. Temperatures shot up again, even more rapidly than before. Ice cores from Greenland show temperature increases of 10 degrees Celsius within a few decades. Some researchers think it might have happened even faster, possibly within just a few years. The ice sheets, weakened by the earlier warming and then stressed by the 1,000-year freeze-thaw cycle, began collapsing in earnest. This is when the real flood happened. This is the event that shows up in every flood myth across the planet. The geological evidence for this final melting period is undeniable. Sediment cores from around the world show a distinct marker called Meltwater Pulse 1b, a massive influx of fresh water into the oceans occurring right at the end of the Younger Dryas. Sea levels rose rapidly, perhaps as much as 13 to 30 feet in less than 500 years. Some estimates suggest even more dramatic rises in shorter time frames during peak melting periods. But it wasn't just gradual sea level rise. There were catastrophic events punctuating the overall trend. The final drainage of Lake Agassiz as the Laurentide ice sheet collapsed. The sudden release of meltwater impounded behind retreating glaciers in Scandinavia. The catastrophic failure of ice dams in Siberia, releasing massive glacial lakes that had formed across northern Asia. Each of these events would have created downstream flooding of almost unimaginable scale. Rivers swollen to many times their normal size, coastal areas inundated by storm surges amplified by rising sea levels. Entire river deltas reworked and expanded as the increased flow transported massive amounts of sediment to the sea. And we're finding the evidence. In the Black Sea, underwater archaeologists have discovered ancient shorelines now submerged under hundreds of feet of water. The Black Sea was once a freshwater lake, isolated from the Mediterranean by a land bridge across what's now the Bosphorus Strait. Around 7,600 years ago, rising Mediterranean sea levels finally breached that natural dam. Seawater poured into the Black Sea basin in what some researchers call the Black Sea deluge. Water levels rose rapidly, drowning coastlines where human communities had lived for thousands of years. The geological evidence is stark. There's a distinct layer in Black Sea sediment cores marking the transition from freshwater to saltwater. Above this layer, freshwater species disappear entirely. Below it, saltwater species don't exist. The flooding was rapid enough that the organisms living there couldn't adapt. They just died. But the Black Sea deluge happened thousands of years after the main post-Younger Dryas melting. It's a later echo of the larger process. What happened in the Black Sea happened everywhere, just earlier and on an even more dramatic scale. The Persian Gulf, now a shallow body of water, was completely dry land at the peak of the Ice Age. It filled with water over several thousand years as sea levels rose, drowning a river valley that had supported human habitation. The entire Gulf, from Kuwait to the Strait of Hormuz, would have transformed from dry land to shallow sea within the span of a few hundred human generations. In Southeast Asia, the transformation was even more dramatic. The Sunda Shelf, connecting modern Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam into a single landmass, was home to millions of square kilometres of tropical forest, grassland, and river systems. As sea levels rose, this entire landscape disappeared beneath the waves. What's now the shallow seas between Indonesian islands was once dry land with its own mountains, rivers, and ecosystems. Modern sonar mapping of the seafloor in these regions reveals river channels, now drowned, that were once major waterways. Side-scan sonar shows features that look like human settlements, geometric structures on the seafloor that are difficult to explain as natural formations. Most of these discoveries are controversial. Underwater archaeology is difficult and expensive, but the evidence is accumulating that significant areas of the continental shelves, now underwater, were not only habitable during the Ice Age, but actively inhabited. The North Sea between Britain and Europe tells a similar story. What's now cold, shallow ocean was once Doggerland, a low-lying landmass that connected Britain to continental Europe. It was home to a rich ecosystem of forests and wetlands. Mammoths, wolves, deer and humans all lived there. Fishing trawlers working the North Sea regularly dredge up bones and artefacts from this lost world. Stone tools, animal remains, even fragments of worked wood that prove humans were actively using this landscape. Doggerland drowned gradually at first as sea levels rose following the Ice Age. But there's evidence of a catastrophic final flood event around 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, triggered by destabilization of underwater sediments, as pressure changed with rising sea levels, created a tsunami that swept across the North Sea basin. The Storegga slide, as it's called, displaced an estimated 3,500 cubic kilometres of sediment. The resulting tsunami would have been tens of metres high, devastating coastlines around the entire North Sea. For communities living in Doggerland, already reduced to a series of low islands and marshy coastlands by rising seas, this tsunami would have been apocalyptic. In the space of a few hours, the remaining dry land would have been swept clean. Survivors would have fled to higher ground in Britain or Europe, carrying with them stories of their drowned homeland. stories that might have been passed down for generations, eventually becoming the kernel of later flood myths. Similar catastrophic events punctuated the post-Ice Age flooding around the world. Underwater landslides triggered by changing sea levels and the removal of ice sheet weight from continental shelves. Catastrophic drainage of ice-dammed lakes creating mega-floods that scoured landscapes and deposited massive debris flows into coastal areas. Storm systems intensified by the rapid climate changes, creating storm surges that pushed seawater far inland along low-lying coasts. The geological record shows all of this. Sediment layers containing marine organisms suddenly appearing in what had been freshwater or terrestrial environments. Massive gravel deposits, called diluvium by early geologists who recognized them as flood deposits, but couldn't explain their scale. Erratics, boulders transported far from their source areas by processes that could only be explained by water or ice on a catastrophic scale. Modern dating techniques have allowed scientists to create increasingly detailed timelines of these events. Radiocarbon dating of organic, material trapped in sediment layers, optically stimulated luminescence dating that determines when sediments were last exposed to sunlight, ice core analysis that provides year-by-year climate records going back hundreds of thousands of years. All of these techniques point to the same conclusion. Between about 11,700 and 8,000 years ago, the world's coastlines underwent a transformation more dramatic than anything in recorded human history. Sea levels rose approximately 400 feet from their Ice Age minimum to near modern levels. This wasn't a smooth process. It was punctuated by rapid pulses of melting, catastrophic drainage events and regional disasters caused by tsunamis and megafloods. For humans living through this period, the changes would have been unmistakable. Coastlines that had been stable for millennia were retreating year by year. Freshwater sources were becoming brackish or disappearing entirely as the ocean encroached. River systems were transforming as increased meltwater flow reworked channels and deltas. Prime hunting and gathering areas were vanishing beneath rising seas, and it wasn't just the coasts. Inland areas were affected too. The massive glacial lakes that formed behind ice dams as the sheets melted weren't just sources of catastrophic flooding when they drained. While they existed, they were barriers to human movement, massive bodies of water that didn't appear on any mental maps passed down from previous generations. Climate zones shifted dramatically as the ice retreated. Areas that had been tundra became forest. Grasslands turned to desert. The entire ecological structure of the planet was reorganizing itself. Human communities had to adapt or die, and many did die. We'll never know how many coastal settlements were completely destroyed, their inhabitants killed or scattered, their material culture lost beneath the waves. But we know some survived, because they carried their stories forward. Stories of a time when the waters rose and drowned the world. Stories of desperate escapes to higher ground. Stories of the world before the flood. Those stories became the flood myths we still tell today. And now, finally, we have the science to understand what really happened. Imagine standing on the coast of what is now the North Sea. It's 13,000 years ago. You're not looking out at water. You're standing in a vast river valley, surrounded by rolling hills covered in pine forests and grasslands. Herds of aurochs, wild horses and red deer move across the landscape. Rivers teem with salmon. The air is crisp and clear. To your north and south you can see for miles across a rich, fertile plain. This isn't England or the Netherlands or Denmark. It's somewhere that doesn't exist on any modern map. It's Doggerland, and 11,000 years ago it was about to disappear forever. Here's what most people don't realise about the world before the Great Flood. The planet during the last ice age looked fundamentally different from the one we know today. Not just colder, different. geographically different, topographically different, a world with an entirely different map. At the peak of the last glaciation, around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were 120 metres lower than they are today. That's nearly 400 feet. The amount of water locked up in massive ice sheets covering North America, Europe and Asia was so enormous that it literally drained the oceans. And when sea levels drop that much, you don't just get wider beaches, you get entire continents appearing where there's now only water. Think about what 120 metres of sea level change actually means. The continental shelves that today lie beneath hundreds of feet of ocean were dry land. Not barren underwater terrain, but functioning ecosystems, forests, grasslands, river systems, lakes, complete landscapes that supported complex animal populations and, crucially, human civilizations. Doggerland is the most famous example, but it was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. At its maximum extent, this lost landmass covered nearly 100,000 square miles. It wasn't an island, it was a land bridge connecting the British Isles to continental Europe. Where there's now the North Sea, there was a landscape as diverse and productive as anywhere in Europe. The geography was spectacular. The area that's now the Dogger Bank, a shallow region in the middle of the North Sea, was a range of low hills. Rivers that today empty separately into the ocean, the Thames, the Rhine, the Seine, all flowed together across Doggerland into a massive river system that eventually reached the Atlantic far to the northwest. Archaeological evidence dredged up from the North Sea floor tells the story of people who lived there. Fishing boats pulling up their nets have brought up worked flints, barbed bone points, fragments of hafted axes. Not just a few scattered artefacts, but enough to indicate substantial human presence. These weren't primitive nomads scratching out a marginal existence. They were sophisticated hunter-gatherers who developed specialised tools for exploiting coastal and riverine resources. The climate in Doggerland during the habitable period was actually more moderate than surrounding regions. Protected from the harshest Atlantic storms by higher ground to the west, warmed by river systems and rich in resources, it was probably one of the most desirable places to live in northern Europe. Population densities might have been quite high by Paleolithic standards. Then the ice began to melt, not slowly and steadily, but in pulses, periods of rapid warming causing sudden releases of meltwater. The seas began rising. At first, it would have been imperceptible, a few inches per year. The oldest members of the community might remember that the fishing grounds used to be a little closer. Maybe they noticed that certain islands were getting smaller. But then the pace accelerated. By 11,000 years ago, sea levels were rising as much as a metre per century in some periods. That might still sound slow, but think about what it means for people living on a low-lying plain. In a single human lifetime, you could watch the sea advance several kilometres inland, entire river valleys flooding, hunting grounds disappearing beneath the waves, communities that had existed for thousands of years forced to retreat again and again. By 200 years ago, Doggerland was gone, except for a few high points that briefly persisted as islands. The entire landmass had been swallowed by the North Sea. Tens of thousands of square miles of human habitat, possibly supporting substantial populations, simply ceased to exist. But Doggerland was just the beginning. Look southeast to what's now Indonesia, Malaysia, and the South China Sea. During the Ice Age, this entire region was a vast landmass called Sunderland. The islands we know today, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, weren't islands at all. They were highlands in an enormous subcontinent roughly the size of India. Sunderland's geography was even more dramatic than Doggerland's. The South China Sea, now one of the largest marginal seas in the world, was mostly dry land. A landscape of river valleys, lakes and coastal plains stretching from modern Vietnam to Indonesia. The climate was tropical and incredibly productive. Rich rainforests, extensive grasslands, abundant freshwater resources, and humans had been living there for a very long time. Modern humans reached Southeast Asia at least 60,000 years ago. They had tens of thousands of years to develop sophisticated cultures adapted to Sunderland's unique environment. Archaeological evidence from the islands that remained above water shows complex tool traditions, systematic exploitation of marine resources, and evidence of long-distance trade networks. But here's where it gets really interesting. Sunderland didn't just support hunter-gatherers. Some researchers believe it might have been home to some of the world's first agricultural societies. The genetic diversity of rice, one of humanity's most important crops, centres on this region. The earliest systematic cultivation of tropical plants might have happened here, not in the Middle East or China, where we've always looked for the origins of agriculture. If that's true, then when Sunderland flooded, we didn't just lose land mass, we potentially lost the birthplace of tropical agriculture, along with all the archaeological evidence of its development. Everything that would tell us how and when ancient Southeast Asians first started cultivating crops is now under 120 feet of seawater. The flooding of Sunderland was catastrophic. Between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, sea level rise drowned millions of square miles. The South China Sea filled like a bathtub. The Java Sea, the Sunda Shelf, enormous coastal plains all disappeared. Populations that might have numbered in the hundreds of thousands were forced to retreat to higher ground, compressing into the islands we know today. And it wasn't just Southeast Asia. The same story played out around the entire world. Look at Beringia, the land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska. Today we think of it as just a narrow strip of land that allowed humans to migrate into the Americas. But during the Ice Age, Beringia was huge, 1,000 miles wide in some places, stretching from the Verkhoyansk Mountains in Siberia to the Mackenzie River in Canada. Beringia wasn't frozen tundra. South of the ice sheets, it was relatively productive grassland, supporting mammoth, bison, horses, and the humans who hunted them. Communities lived there for thousands of years, not just passing through on their way to somewhere else. It was home. When the seas rose, Beringia drowned from both directions. The Bering Sea advancing from the south, the Chukchi Sea from the north. By 11,000 years ago, the land bridge was severed. By 9,000 years ago, most of it was underwater. Another vast human habitat simply gone. The pattern repeats everywhere you look. The Persian Gulf was a river valley, the lowest point of the Tigris-Euphrates system. The Gulf of Mexico extended much farther south, with extensive coastal plains along what's now the continental shelf. The Mediterranean was smaller, with land connections between Sicily and North Africa that no longer exist. Around the entire planet, the habitable world shrank dramatically as the ice melted. And here's the crucial point. These drowned coastlines weren't marginal territories. They were prime real estate. Coastal and riverine environments are always the most productive habitats for hunter-gatherer societies. They offer the greatest diversity of food resources, the most reliable water supplies, the easiest transportation routes. If you wanted to find the highest population densities in Ice Age human society, you'd look along coastlines and major river systems, exactly the places that are now underwater. We've built our entire understanding of Ice Age humanity from the inland sites that survived, but we're looking in the wrong places. The real centres of human population are beneath the waves. This is where Graham Hancock's controversial theories come into the picture. Hancock has spent decades arguing that we've fundamentally misunderstood human prehistory. He suggests that the flooded continental shelves might have supported not just hunter-gatherers, but advanced civilizations. Societies that develop sophisticated technologies, monumental architecture, perhaps even writing and mathematics during the Ice Age. The mainstream archaeological community has largely dismissed these ideas. They point out that Hancock often relies on circumstantial evidence and speculative interpretations. There's no unambiguous proof of Ice Age civilizations on par with ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. But here's the thing. The lack of evidence isn't quite the same as evidence of absence, especially when we're talking about sites that are now underwater. Consider what we've actually found beneath the waves. Off the coast of India near Gujarat, marine archaeologists have discovered geometric structures in 120 feet of water. Stone formations that some researchers believe are too regular to be natural. Dating of materials recovered from the site suggests human activity there when it was above water, before 9,000 years ago. Off the coast of Japan, underwater structures near Yonaguni have sparked decades of debate. Massive stone formations with apparently right-angled edges, flat surfaces, and what look like carved steps. Natural geological formations, say most geologists. Too regular to be entirely natural, say others. The formations would have been above water during the Ice Age, accessible to the people who reached Japan at least 35,000 years ago. In the Mediterranean, more than 200 prehistoric settlements have been discovered underwater along various coastlines. Most are from relatively recent periods, 3,000 to 5,000 years old, but they demonstrate that people did build permanent structures right at the water's edge, exactly the kind of sites that would have been destroyed by the earlier, more dramatic sea level rise. Off the coast of Florida, divers have found underwater sinkholes containing human remains and artifacts dating back 12,000 to 14,000 years. These aren't structures, but they prove that people were actively using what are now submarine caves when they were accessible above water. The sites show evidence of systematic human activity, suggesting organised societies. The problem is that underwater archaeology is incredibly difficult and expensive. We've surveyed maybe 1% of the drowned Ice Age coastlines. We're essentially trying to understand human prehistory, while ignoring the places where most people probably actually lived. It's like trying to understand modern civilization while only excavating in mountains and deserts. But there's one flood event we can reconstruct in detail, and it provides a terrifying glimpse of what the ancient world experienced: the Black Sea deluge. Around 7,600 years ago, something catastrophic happened in what is now Turkey, and the regions surrounding the Black Sea. During the Ice Age, the Black Sea was actually a giant freshwater lake, much smaller than today, and sitting well below global sea level. It was surrounded by fertile plains where agricultural societies were flourishing. These weren't primitive farmers. By this time, humans had been cultivating crops for thousands of years. They had permanent villages, domesticated animals, pottery, woven textiles, complex societies. Then the ice sheets melted and global sea levels rose above a crucial threshold. Water from the Mediterranean, which sits much higher than the Black Sea basin, began spilling over the Bosporus, the narrow strait separating the two bodies of water. At first, it was probably just a trickle, a small stream connecting the Mediterranean to the lower-lying Black Sea basin. But water is relentless. It erodes. It widens channels. That trickle became a stream. The stream became a river. The river became a cataract. Geologists who have studied the Bosporus estimate that at its peak, water was pouring through the strait with a force 200 times greater than Niagara Falls. Every day, enough seawater flooded into the Black Sea basin to cover an area the size of Manhattan Island to a depth of 6 feet. The roar would have been audible for miles. The ground itself would have shaken. The Black Sea level rose dramatically. Estimates suggest the water level increased by hundreds of feet over the course of months or years, not centuries. For the agricultural societies living around the lake, it would have been apocalyptic. Imagine waking up one morning to find your village flooding, not from rain or a seasonal river overflow, but from a sea that's rising and never stopping. You and your community retreat to higher ground, but the water keeps coming. Weeks pass, then months. Entire landscapes that your ancestors had farmed for generations disappear beneath the waves. Villages are abandoned in panic. People flee in all directions, carrying what they can, losing everything else. The archaeological evidence supports this scenario. Around 7,600 years ago, there's a sudden appearance of refugee populations in surrounding regions. Agricultural societies with Black Sea cultural characteristics suddenly show up in Anatolia, the Balkans and other areas. The original societies around the Black Sea simply vanish from the archaeological record. And here's where it connects to the flood myths. The Black Sea region is right where some of the oldest Mesopotamian civilizations developed. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the people who would eventually produce the Epic of Gilgamesh with its detailed flood narrative. If refugees from the Black Sea deluge spread throughout the region, they would have carried their stories with them. Stories of the world drowning, of water rising impossibly high, of entire civilizations swept away. The biblical flood narrative describes a catastrophic inundation that destroys the world, with a righteous family surviving in a vessel. The Black Sea deluge would have seemed exactly like that to the people experiencing it. Not the entire planet flooding, but their entire world, everything they knew, disappearing beneath the waves. But the Black Sea wasn't unique. It was just one event we can study in detail. Similar catastrophes were happening around the entire planet between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago. Every coastal population, everywhere, would have experienced some version of the same horror. Seas rising, land vanishing, communities forced to retreat again and again. For the people living through it, the mechanism wouldn't have mattered. They wouldn't have understood ice sheets or isostatic rebound or meltwater pulses. All they would have known is that the water kept coming, that their world was drowning, that the gods, or God, or whatever supernatural forces they believed in, had decided to destroy everything, and that's what they remembered. That's what they passed down through oral traditions for thousands of years. Not the scientific explanation, but the experience, the terror, the loss, the sense that the entire world had ended, and only a few survivors remained to restart civilization. The flood myths were real, because the floods were real. The world before 11,000 years ago had more land, more coastline, more human habitat than we can easily imagine today. And then, in what must have seemed like divine judgment to the people experiencing it, vast portions of that world simply ceased to exist, swallowed by seas that rose and never stopped rising. Those lost coastlines weren't empty, they were home. But what did this actually feel like for the people who lived through it? We've talked about meltwater pulses and sea level rise and climate catastrophe like they're abstract scientific phenomena, graphs and data points. But these were real events that happened to real people. People who had no concept of ice sheets or global climate systems or tectonic processes. They just knew that the world they had always known was ending, and they had to survive. Imagine you're living on the coast 13,000 years ago. Your family has occupied this stretch of beach for generations beyond counting. Your grandparents' grandparents told stories about their ancestors hunting on these same shores. The fishing grounds offshore, the fresh water spring up the beach, the cave where you shelter during storms. This isn't just where you live. This is the entire world. Everything beyond the next headland is just stories and rumours. Then one year, you notice the winter storms seem more violent than usual. They push the high tide mark further up the beach than you've ever seen it. Some of the driftwood markers your grandfather placed to track the tides are now permanently underwater. You think it's strange, but storms are unpredictable. The sea always rises and falls. This is just a particularly bad season. But the next year it happens again, and the year after that. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the beach is shrinking. That freshwater spring you've relied on for drinking water, it's starting to taste brackish. Salt water is infiltrating the aquifer. The fishing grounds where your people have always caught most of their food are changing. Some familiar species disappear. Others appear that you've never seen before. The water itself seems different, warmer in winter, more turbulent. After a generation, the change becomes undeniable. The beach where your grandparents gathered shellfish is now permanently submerged. The cave that had sheltered your family for countless generations is flooding during high tides. You've moved your camp 3 times already, each time further inland, each time leaving behind fishing spots, gathering areas, hunting grounds that had sustained your people forever. And here's the thing, you're not imagining this. The archaeological record shows exactly this pattern playing out across thousands of coastal sites worldwide. Settlements occupied for millennia, showing continuous habitation through tools and remains and fire pits suddenly abandoned. Not gradually, not because people slowly drifted away, abandoned rapidly, as if the inhabitants grabbed what they could carry and fled. At sites like Atlit Yam off the coast of Israel, archaeologists have found a complete Neolithic village preserved underwater, stone houses still standing, a stone circle still intact, even a well, carefully constructed and maintained, now submerged under 30 feet of Mediterranean water. The evidence suggests the inhabitants left quickly. Tools were abandoned, food storage areas left unsealed. Whatever drove them away didn't give them time to pack carefully. The same pattern appears at dozens of sites. The Doggerland settlements in what's now the North Sea, coastal communities along what was once the Persian Gulf coastline, Indonesian sites that were above water 12,000 years ago and are now deep beneath the Java Sea. All show signs of rapid abandonment during the period of catastrophic sea level rise. But here's what's really remarkable. The people who fled these drowning coastlines didn't just scatter randomly. They maintained their cultural identities. They remembered. The archaeological evidence shows coastal populations moving inland and upland, carrying their distinctive tool technologies with them, maintaining their cultural traditions, telling stories about what had happened to their ancestral homes. This is where oral tradition becomes absolutely crucial. Modern Western culture tends to dismiss oral traditions as unreliable. Stories change with each telling. Memory fades, facts get distorted. But indigenous cultures that maintained oral traditions into the modern era have proven this assumption completely wrong. When oral tradition is treated as sacred, when the accuracy of transmission is considered essential, when communities develop specific cultural practices for preserving information across generations, the fidelity is astonishing. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions describe coastlines that haven't existed for over 10,000 years. Stories passed down through 300 or 400 generations can still accurately identify specific islands that are now submerged, specific land bridges that are now underwater channels. Geologists have verified these oral histories against core samples and sea level data. The stories are accurate. The same pattern appears worldwide. Pacific Islander traditions describe specific migration routes between islands, including stopping points that are now submerged seamounts. The geographical details match perfectly with bathymetric surveys showing shallow areas that were above water 11,000 years ago. Native American traditions from the Pacific Northwest describe when certain islands were connected to the mainland. Geological surveys confirm these land bridges existed during the period of rapid sea level rise and were severed exactly when the stories say they were. These weren't vague myths about a flood. These were precise geographical memories, transmitted with extraordinary fidelity across hundreds of generations. And they all describe the same basic experience: watching the waters rise, losing ancestral lands, fleeing inland, being forced to adapt to completely new environments with no preparation. But some groups seem to have done better than others. Some flood stories describe advance warning, knowledge of what was coming, time to prepare, and there's archaeological evidence that suggests this might be more than just narrative embellishment. Certain coastal populations show signs of planned, organised migration rather than panicked flight. In Southeast Asia, there's evidence that some groups began moving inland several generations before their coastal settlements became completely uninhabitable. They established inland camps while maintaining their coastal villages. They created fallback positions, insurance against whatever was happening to the sea. This suggests they understood the trend. They recognized that the ocean was encroaching and made preparations accordingly. How would they know? Simple observation over generations. Your grandparents tell stories about hunting on land that's now shallow water. Your parents remember when the beach extended much further than it does now. You've personally watched landmarks disappear beneath the waves. The pattern is clear. The ocean is coming, and it's not stopping. This kind of generational knowledge would have been incredibly valuable. Groups that recognized the trend and prepared for it would have had massive advantages over those that didn't. They could select new territories while choice locations were still available. They could establish claims and relationships with inland populations before desperation forced them to compete. They could transfer their coastal subsistence strategies, fishing and seafood gathering, to rivers and lakes in their new territories. The groups that waited too long, that clung to ancestral territories until the water literally drove them away, would have been at a severe disadvantage. They'd be refugees in unfamiliar territories, competing with established populations for resources, trying to develop entirely new survival strategies under desperate circumstances. And this is where the boats become absolutely central to the story. Every major flood myth features a boat or ark. Noah's Ark, Utnapishtim's boat in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Manu's boat in Hindu tradition, Deucalion's ark in Greek mythology, You the Great's flood control boats in Chinese tradition. The specifics vary, but the core element remains constant. Survival depended on boats. Why? Because for coastal populations watching the waters rise, boats weren't just useful. They were existential. They were the technology that allowed you to maintain access to drowning fishing grounds. They let you reach islands that were becoming increasingly isolated as land bridges submerged. They enabled you to explore new coastlines and rivers as you moved inland. They allowed you to carry more supplies than you could manage on foot when you finally had to flee. But boats were also psychologically significant. When everything you've known is being swallowed by water, when the land itself betrays you by vanishing beneath the waves, a boat represents control. It's a piece of ground that moves with you, a floating island of safety in a world where solid ground is disappearing. The boat becomes a symbol of survival itself. Of course it would occupy a central place in flood traditions. The archaeological evidence supports this symbolic and practical importance. We see a dramatic increase in maritime technology starting around 13,000 years ago. More sophisticated boat-building techniques, fish hooks and nets designed for deep water fishing, harpoon points for hunting marine mammals, evidence of long-distance sea voyages to islands that were becoming increasingly remote as sea levels rose. This wasn't gradual technological evolution. This was rapid innovation driven by necessity. Coastal populations had to become better at maritime subsistence because the coastline they depended on was literally moving away from them. The fish that used to be accessible from shore now required boats to reach. The shellfish beds that used to be exposed at low tide were now permanently submerged, requiring diving or dredging to access. And as the floods continued, as more and more coastal territory vanished, the survivors were forced inland. This created one of the most significant migration events in human history. Coastal populations that had specialised in maritime subsistence for millennia suddenly had to compete with inland populations. They brought their technologies, their cultural practices, their stories. But they also brought desperation. The genetic evidence tells a fascinating story about this period. Human populations worldwide show signs of what geneticists call population bottlenecks around 11,000 to 12,000 years ago. Not as severe as the Great Bottleneck 900,000 years earlier, but significant. Population sizes crashed, genetic diversity decreased, the signature of widespread population stress. But then, after the flood subsided, after sea level stabilised around 8,000 years ago, we see explosive population growth. The genetic data shows human populations expanding rapidly from a relatively small number of founder groups. These founders carried specific genetic markers, cultural traditions, and technological knowledge that had survived the flood period. They became the ancestors of the civilizations that would emerge in the following millennia. This pattern appears in regional populations worldwide. In the middle, east, genetic analysis suggests the populations that founded the first agricultural civilizations in Mesopotamia and the Levant descended from small groups that had survived the flood period, probably as refugees from the drowning Persian Gulf coastline and the vanished Fertile Crescent lowlands. In East Asia, the founders of rice-cultivating cultures show genetic signatures consistent with coastal populations that moved inland during the flood period, bringing maritime subsistence knowledge that they adapted to river valley environments. In Europe, the populations that spread agriculture across the continent after 8,000 years ago descended from Anatolian groups that genetic evidence suggests had been displaced by rising Mediterranean sea levels. In the Americas, the founding populations of later civilizations show genetic patterns consistent with coastal groups forced inland by the inundation of vast territories along both the Pacific and Atlantic coastlines. What this tells us is profound. The survivors of the Great Floods weren't just random groups that happened to make it through. They were people who had been selected by the most intense environmental pressure imaginable. They had survived watching their world literally drown. They had made the psychological transition from coastal to inland subsistence. They had maintained their cultural knowledge and group cohesion through multiple forced relocations. They had developed the technological flexibility to exploit entirely new environments. These weren't just survivors. They were the most adaptable, innovative, resilient people of their generation. And when the floods finally stopped, when sea levels stabilised and the world stopped changing quite so catastrophically, they were perfectly positioned to become the founders of something new. The traumatic experience of the floods had forged them into people capable of dramatic innovation. They had already lost everything once. They weren't going to let it happen again. This is why the flood survivors became civilization builders. They had learned that the environment couldn't be trusted, that the old ways, the traditional subsistence patterns that had worked for thousands of years, could fail catastrophically. They had learned that survival required innovation, planning, the ability to completely restructure your life when circumstances demanded it. These are exactly the cognitive skills and cultural attitudes that agriculture and civilization require. When you're a hunter-gatherer living in a stable environment, there's no particular incentive to develop agriculture. The wild resources are reliable. Why spend enormous amounts of labour clearing land and planting crops when you can just gather what nature provides? But when you've watched the ocean swallow your ancestral fishing grounds, when you've been forced to move 5 times in 3 generations, when you've learned through traumatic experience that stability is an illusion, the calculation changes. Suddenly the control that agriculture offers becomes attractive. Yes, it's more work, Yes, it requires staying in one place and committing to long-term planning, but it also means you're not dependent on the whims of nature. You choose what to grow, you store surpluses against bad years, you create a buffer between yourself and catastrophe. For people who had lived through the floods, this kind of security would have been incredibly appealing, and this is exactly what we see in the archaeological record. The development of agriculture worldwide happens in the immediate aftermath of the flood period. The first domestication of wheat and barley in the Middle East around 9,500 years ago. Rice cultivation in China beginning around 9,000 years ago. Corn domestication in Mesoamerica starting around 8,700 years ago. These aren't coincidences. They're the direct result of populations that have been traumatized by catastrophic environmental change, seeking ways to exert control over their food supply. The flood survivors didn't just build the first civilizations, they built them because of the floods. The trauma had created both the necessity and the psychological readiness for dramatic social change. The stories they told about the deluge weren't just memories. They were foundational myths explaining why the world worked the way it did, why the gods were capricious and required careful management through ritual, why planning and preparation were essential, why some lineages had survived when others perished. These stories became the core of emerging civilizations. The flood narratives in Sumerian, Babylonian, Hebrew and other Middle Eastern traditions weren't borrowed from each other, though they influenced each other later. They were independent memories of the same catastrophic events, preserved by different survivor populations, each telling their own version of how their ancestors made it through when the world drowned. And the psychological impact of these traditions shaped everything that came after. The architecture of the first cities, the structure of early religions, the emphasis on controlling water through irrigation and flood control, the preoccupation with catastrophe and survival that runs through ancient literature, all of it traces back to the lived experience of watching the waters rise and having to flee. The survivors carried their trauma forward, but they also carried their resilience, their adaptability, their hard-won knowledge about how to survive when everything changes. These were the people who would build the pyramids, who would develop writing and mathematics, who would create the first law codes and the first empires. The founders of human civilization were refugees from the deluge, and they never forgot where they came from. For decades, the flood myths were just that. Myths. Stories passed down through generations, embellished with supernatural elements considered culturally important but historically unreliable. Archaeologists and historians treated them the way you might treat your grandfather's fishing stories, entertaining, maybe containing a grain of truth, but not something you'd build a scientific theory around. Then we started looking underwater, and everything changed. The first major breakthrough came in the 1960s and 70s, when marine archaeologists began systematically surveying continental shelves. They were looking for shipwrecks, ancient ports, anything that might tell us about maritime trade in the ancient world. What they found was far stranger than anyone expected. They found cities, entire settlements, complete with streets, buildings and harbours, sitting in water that was now 30, 40, sometimes 60 metres deep. At first, these discoveries were treated as anomalies. Maybe these were ports that had subsided due to earthquakes. Maybe they were built during some local low-water event. But as more sites were discovered, the pattern became undeniable. These weren't isolated incidents. They were everywhere. Off the coast of Gujarat in western India, marine archaeologists discovered what might be the remains of ancient Dwarka, the legendary city from Hindu texts that was said to have been swallowed by the sea. The site sits roughly 40 metres below current sea level. Sonar mapping reveals massive structural foundations, walls running for hundreds of metres, what appear to be organised street grids. The structures show clear signs of human engineering, blocks fitted together with precision, defensive walls designed to protect against something. Carbon dating of organic material from the site consistently returns dates between 9,500 and 11,000 years ago, right in the window when meltwater pulse 1b would have been drowning coastlines across the world. The architecture suggests a sophisticated society. These weren't simple fishing villages. The scale of the construction indicates organised labour, centralised planning, probably thousands of people working in coordination. They built massive stone structures that would have required advanced engineering knowledge, and then the sea claimed it all. But Dwarka is just the beginning. In the Mediterranean, underwater archaeologists have mapped extensive ruins off the coasts of Greece, Turkey and the Levant. One particularly remarkable site lies off the coast of modern-day Alexandria in Egypt. Sonar and diving surveys have revealed what appears to be an enormous harbour complex, now submerged under 15 metres of water. The dating is consistent, between 11,000 and 9,000 years ago, right when the flood events were reaching their peak. The harbour shows evidence of sudden abandonment, ships left at moorings, cargo still in warehouses, as if the inhabitants expected to return. They never did. In the Persian Gulf, the story repeats. Marine surveys have identified dozens of sites along what would have been the ancient coastline, now drowned under 50 to 80 metres of water. Some researchers believe these ruins represent remnants of the civilization that Sumerian texts describe as existing before the Great Flood, the legendary cities that taught humanity agriculture, writing, and mathematics before being consumed by rising waters. The Persian Gulf is particularly interesting because geological analysis shows it was completely dry land until about 12,000 years ago. The entire Gulf, an area of over 240,000 square kilometres, was a fertile river valley. Archaeological evidence suggests this valley supported substantial human populations. Then, over a period of just a few thousand years, the entire region flooded. By 9,000 years ago, it looked essentially like it does today. Imagine living in that valley. Your ancestors had been there for generations, maybe thousands of years. The rivers provided water, the soil was rich, game was abundant. Then the sea began to rise. At first, just a few metres. Annoying, but you could move inland, then faster, then catastrophically fast during pulse events. Within a human lifetime, everything your people had built was underwater. This wasn't myth. This was documented geological history, confirmed by sediment cores drilled from the seafloor. Speaking of sediment cores, they provide some of the most compelling evidence for rapid flood events. When geologists drill into ocean or lake beds, they extract long cylinders of sediment that represent thousands or millions of years of accumulated material. Each layer tells a story about what was happening when it was deposited. Cores taken from sites around the world show distinctive markers at the 11,000-year level. Sudden transitions from terrestrial sediments to marine sediments. Evidence of rapid, catastrophic deposition events. Layers of mixed material suggesting massive influxes of water, carrying debris from flooded lands. The geological signature of catastrophe. One particularly revealing set of cores comes from the Black Sea. These cores show a dramatic transition around 9,400 years ago. Below that level, the sediments contain freshwater organisms. Above it, marine species. The transition zone is remarkably thin, suggesting the change happened very quickly. This supports what geologists call the Black Sea deluge hypothesis. The Black Sea was originally a freshwater lake, sitting well below sea level, surrounded by human settlements. When Mediterranean sea levels rose high enough, around 9,400 years ago, water breached the Bosporus and came pouring into the basin. The inflow would have been catastrophic. possibly equivalent to 200 Niagara Falls. Within months or years, the Black Sea rose dramatically, flooding thousands of square kilometres of inhabited coastline. Underwater surveys of the Black Sea have found extensive evidence of submerged settlements at depths of 100 metres or more. Ancient shorelines marked by shells and beach deposits, now far below the surface, and scattered across these drowned landscapes, artefacts, pottery, tools, structural remains, the debris of civilizations that were there one generation and gone the next. But perhaps the most intriguing archaeological evidence comes from sites that weren't underwater, from settlements that survived the floods because they were built on higher ground, places where people who witnessed the catastrophe left records of what they experienced. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is one of these survivor sites, dating to approximately 11,500 years ago, right at the beginning of the flood period. It represents something unprecedented in human history. Massive stone temples built by people who supposedly hadn't yet developed agriculture or settled civilization. The structures at Göbekli Tepe required coordinated labour from hundreds of people. The stone pillars, some weighing 10 to 20 tons, had to be quarried, transported and erected using only Stone Age technology. The carvings show sophisticated artistic ability and symbolic thinking. Animals, abstract symbols, narrative scenes that might represent actual historical events. Some researchers interpret the imagery at Göbekli Tepe as depicting a cataclysm, scenes of destruction, flooding, chaos. Whether this interpretation is correct remains debated, but the timing is suggestive. The site was built right when the world was experiencing the most dramatic climate changes in human history. Even more intriguing is what happened to Göbekli Tepe. Around 10,000 years ago, at the height of the flooding events, the site was deliberately buried. The inhabitants carefully filled in their temples with debris, preserving them but making them inaccessible. Then they left. Why would people invest enormous effort in building these structures, only to bury them 1,000 years later? One possibility is that the catastrophes happening around them, the flooding of coastal settlements, the dramatic climate changes, the displacement of populations, made the site untenable or inspired them to move elsewhere. The people of Göbekli Tepe would have witnessed the catastrophe even if they weren't directly affected by rising seas. Refugees from flooded coastlines would have been moving inland, bringing stories of the disaster. Trade networks would have been disrupted. The entire social and economic world they knew would have been transforming. Cave paintings from this period also show intriguing patterns. In caves across Europe and Asia, there's a notable change in artistic style around 11,000 years ago. Earlier paintings predominantly show hunting scenes, animals, daily life. After the 11,000 year mark, we see more abstract symbols, more scenes that might represent supernatural or catastrophic events. In Lascaux Cave in France, some paintings show what appear to be waves or flooding. In Altamira in Spain, there are scenes that researchers have interpreted as depicting storms or inundations. Whether these literally represent flood memories or are more symbolic interpretations remains uncertain. But the timing of these artistic changes corresponds perfectly with the meltwater pulse events. Artifacts from human settlements during this period also tell a story of disruption and adaptation. Stone tool technologies change rapidly around 11,000 years ago. New designs appear, old styles disappear. This suggests populations were being displaced, mixing with new groups, adapting to new environments. In the Middle East, this is when we see the first clear evidence of intentional plant cultivation. The Younger Dryas cooling period, followed by rapid warming and the flood pulses, would have devastated wild food sources in coastal areas. Populations forced inland would have needed new survival strategies. Agriculture appears to have emerged partly as a response to this crisis. The genetic evidence supports this interpretation. DNA analysis of ancient populations shows significant mixing events around 11,000 years ago. Previously isolated groups suddenly showing genetic contributions from distant populations. This is the signature of mass migration, of population fleeing disasters and relocating to new territories. Modern underwater archaeology technology has revolutionized our ability to find and study these submerged sites. Side-scan sonar can map vast areas of seafloor, revealing structures invisible from the surface. Remotely operated vehicles can explore sites too deep or dangerous for human divers. Ground-penetrating radar adapted for underwater use can detect buried structures under layers of sediment. In recent years, these technologies have accelerated the pace of discovery. In 2020, researchers announced the discovery of a massive submerged settlement off the coast of Israel, dating to approximately 10,000 years ago. The site covers over 40 hectares and shows evidence of sophisticated urban planning. Off the coast of North America, underwater surveys have revealed what appear to be ancient settlements now submerged under 50 meters of water. These sites, if confirmed, would represent some of the earliest human habitation in the Americas, predating most currently known sites. The populations who built them would have witnessed the flooding of the Bering Land Bridge and the dramatic reshaping of the North American coastline. In Southeast Asia, marine archaeologists are mapping extensive submerged landscapes in what's now the South China Sea. During the Ice Age, this region was the Sunda Shelf, a vast area of dry land connecting modern-day islands into a single continental landmass. Sea level rise flooded millions of square kilometres, drowning what may have been one of the most densely populated regions of the ancient world. The archaeological evidence from these submerged sites consistently shows the same pattern. Sophisticated settlements, evidence of complex societies, then sudden abandonment right around 11,000 to 9,000 years ago. Not gradual decline, not slow migration. Rapid, often catastrophic displacement. Carbon dating has been crucial in establishing these timelines. Organic materials found at these sites, wood from structures, plant remains, bones, can be precisely dated using radiocarbon analysis. The dates cluster remarkably tightly around the known meltwater pulse events. At sites around the world, we see the same chronological pattern. Continuous occupation for thousands of years, then sudden abandonment between 11,000 and 9,000 years ago, followed by reoccupation at much higher elevations or in completely different regions. This isn't coincidence. This is the archaeological signature of a global catastrophe. The flood events recorded in hundreds of cultural traditions, now confirmed by scientific evidence. But the archaeological record also shows us something else. It shows us resilience. The survivors of these floods didn't just give up. They adapted, innovated, rebuilt. The period after the major flood pulses, from about 9,000 years ago onward, sees an explosion of human technological and social development. This is when agriculture becomes widespread, when permanent settlements start appearing across the Middle East, Europe and Asia, when pottery, writing and complex social hierarchies begin emerging. The traditional archaeological narrative has always treated these developments as the beginning of civilization. But the underwater evidence suggests they were actually the recovery phase, the rebuilding after catastrophe. The refugees from the drowned coastlines brought with them whatever knowledge their societies had accumulated. Maritime technology, construction techniques, social organisational strategies. They mixed with inland populations, creating a burst of innovation as different cultural traditions combined. Current archaeological research continues to reveal new evidence almost monthly. In 2023, a team announced the discovery of stone structures off the coast of Sicily that appear to be a submerged bridge or causeway, dated to at least 9,000 years ago. In the same year, surveys off Japan revealed what might be ritual structures, now under 40 metres of water, aligned with astronomical markers. Each discovery adds detail to our understanding of what happened. Each site provides another piece of evidence that the flood myths weren't myths at all. They were memories, distorted by time and retelling, but rooted in real events that fundamentally shaped human history. The archaeological evidence is unambiguous. Between 11,000 and 9,000 years ago, sea levels rose dramatically. This rise drowned extensive coastal settlements. The populations who lived in these settlements were displaced, creating waves of migration that mixed previously isolated groups and accelerated cultural and technological development. The flood happened. We've found the drowned cities. We've dated the catastrophe. We've mapped the submerged landscapes where our ancestors lived before the water came. What remains is understanding the full impact of these events, how they shaped human psychology, culture, and civilization. Because the flood didn't just destroy the old world, it created the foundation for everything that came after. Every civilization, every cultural tradition, every human society that exists today descends from the survivors of that ancient catastrophe. We are all children of the flood, and now, finally, we have the evidence to prove it. But the flood didn't just kill millions and reshape coastlines. It did something far more profound to human civilization. It created a rupture in our development so severe that we're still dealing with its consequences 11,000 years later. Think about this timeline. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived essentially the same way. Hunter-gatherers following animal migrations, collecting seasonal plants, living in small mobile groups. The archaeological record from 100,000 years ago looks remarkably similar to sites from 20,000 years ago. Same basic tools, same settlement patterns, same lifestyle. Then suddenly, impossibly quickly, everything changes. Within just a few thousand years after the flood, we see the emergence of agriculture, permanent settlements, complex social hierarchies, monumental architecture, and organized religion. The transformation is so rapid and so complete that archaeologists have struggled for decades to explain it. They call it the Neolithic Revolution, the birth of civilization. But revolution implies it came from within, that humans just suddenly decided to change everything about how they lived. The evidence suggests something very different. It suggests they had no choice. The flood had destroyed their world. They had to build a new one. Let's start with agriculture. For generations, archaeologists believed farming developed gradually. Groups of hunter-gatherers noticed that plants grew where seeds fell. They started deliberately planting a few crops while continuing to hunt and gather. Over thousands of years they became more dependent on cultivation, until eventually they were full-time farmers. Neat story, completely wrong. The genetic evidence from domesticated crops tells a different tale. Around 10,000 years ago, multiple plant species across different continents underwent sudden, dramatic genetic changes. Wild wheat and barley in the Middle East, rice in China, corn in Mexico, potatoes in the Andes, all transformed from wild plants into domesticated crops within a remarkably short time window. This wasn't gradual experimentation. This was systematic, intentional plant breeding carried out by people who understood genetics even if they didn't have our vocabulary for it. Someone was making deliberate selections, crossing varieties, propagating desired traits across multiple generations. But here's what's really strange. These early farmers weren't just growing food. They were growing it with techniques that shouldn't exist yet. Archaeological sites from 9,000 years ago in Turkey show evidence of crop rotation, something we thought wasn't invented until thousands of years later. Terraced farming appears in Peru far earlier than it has any right to. Irrigation systems in Mesopotamia show sophistication that should have taken centuries to develop, but appear almost fully formed. It's as if someone already knew how to farm, not experimentally, not through trial and error, but with practiced knowledge that could only come from long experience. This is where the flood survivors come in. Not everyone died when the oceans rose. The people living on those drowned coastlines, they had centuries, maybe thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. They understood seasonal patterns, plant cycles, animal behaviour. They had developed technologies for processing and storing food. They knew how to organise labour for large projects. When the waters came, the survivors fled inland with nothing but what they could carry. No tools, no settlements, no material culture. But they carried something more valuable. They carried knowledge. And when they reached the highlands, where other humans were still living as the hunter-gatherers, they brought the seeds of civilization with them. Literally. Genetic analysis of ancient grain stores shows that early domesticated varieties spread far faster than would be possible through natural diffusion. Someone was deliberately moving seeds across vast distances, sharing agricultural knowledge between communities that should have had no contact. This explains one of the great mysteries of early agriculture. Why did farming appear almost simultaneously across the globe in the centuries following the flood? The traditional explanation is convergent evolution, that multiple groups independently invented the same solution to the same problem, but the timing is too precise, the techniques too similar. It's more likely that knowledge from coastal survivors dispersed in multiple directions, carrying agricultural expertise to communities that had previously relied entirely on hunting and gathering. But agriculture was just the beginning. The post-flood period also saw an explosion in construction technology, not just simple shelters, but massive, sophisticated structures that required organised labour, mathematical knowledge, and engineering expertise. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built around 9500 BCE, features T-shaped limestone pillars weighing up to 16 tons, carved with elaborate reliefs and arranged in circular structures. The builders had to quarry the stone, transport it, shape it, and erect it. All of this before they had developed pottery, before they had metal tools, supposedly before they even had permanent settlements. The site required massive coordinated labour. Archaeologists estimate it would have taken hundreds of workers decades to build. But how do you organise hundreds of people when human groups at this time supposedly consisted of small nomadic bands of maybe 30 to 50 individuals? The answer is you can't, unless those builders weren't typical hunter-gatherers, unless they were survivors from coastal populations that had already developed complex social organisation. Groups that understood how to coordinate large labour forces because they'd done it before in the coastal cities now lost beneath the waves. And Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. Across the post-flood world we see similar structures appearing with suspicious timing. Stone temples in Malta, earthwork mounds in Louisiana, megalithic structures in Britain. All built thousands of years before their builders supposedly had the social organisation or technical knowledge to construct them. The pattern is consistent. The archaeological record shows primitive hunter-gatherers suddenly building like they have centuries of architectural experience. Because maybe they did, or rather, maybe their teachers did. But the survivors brought more than just practical knowledge. They brought something darker, something that would shape human civilization in ways we're still grappling with. Trauma. Imagine watching your entire world drown. The places where you were born, where your parents and grandparents lived, where your children played, all of it vanishing beneath rising waters. Your friends, your family, your community, most of them dead. The survivors, forced to flee to unfamiliar lands where the locals view them as strangers, as competitors for resources. That kind of collective trauma doesn't just disappear. It gets embedded in culture, in mythology, in the very foundations of how people organise their societies, and we can trace its fingerprints across every ancient civilization that emerged in the flood's aftermath. First, there's the obsession with high ground. The Mesopotamians built ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids that elevated temples above the floodplain. The Egyptians constructed on the desert plateau, above the Nile's flood zone. The Maya built enormous pyramid complexes. The Inca created entire cities on mountain peaks. Standard explanation: these structures put religious buildings closer to the heavens. But there's another interpretation. They put people above the water. They create sanctuaries that couldn't be drowned. Every major ancient civilization built monuments designed to survive flooding. That's not coincidence. That's cultural memory. Second, there's the development of flood defences that seem absurdly overbuilt for their environment. The earliest Mesopotamian cities were surrounded by massive earthwork dikes and drainage systems far more extensive than required for normal river flooding. The Chinese developed sophisticated levee systems along the Yellow River thousands of years before historical flooding would justify such enormous investments. They were preparing for catastrophes they hadn't personally experienced, because their ancestors had experienced them. The stories have been passed down. Build high, build strong. The water can take everything. Third, and perhaps most tellingly, there's the emergence of complex religious and legal systems all centred on the same theme: divine judgment through water. The Mesopotamian flood myths aren't just stories, they're theological frameworks. The gods send floods to punish human wickedness. The righteous are saved by building boats and escaping to high ground. Survival depends on following divine law. This pattern repeats across cultures. The biblical flood story, the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the Hindu myths of Manu, the Greek story of Deucalion, all of them frame flooding as divine punishment and survival, as a reward for righteousness. This isn't accidental. This is how traumatized societies process catastrophe. They create meaning from disaster. They develop rules to prevent it from happening again. The flood becomes more than a historical event. It becomes a moral framework. Behave correctly and you'll be saved. Transgress and the waters will come. This theological innovation had enormous social consequences. Pre-flood human groups were egalitarian. Archaeological evidence from Paleolithic sites shows little wealth differentiation. People lived in similar dwellings, had similar possessions, presumably had similar social status. Post-flood civilizations developed rigid hierarchies almost immediately. Priest-kings who claimed divine authority to interpret the god's will and prevent future catastrophes. Elaborate legal codes that prescribe behaviour in minute detail. Social classes that determined who had access to resources and protection. Slavery that provided labour for massive construction projects. The flood created authoritarianism. Not because authoritarian systems are inherently better, but because traumatized populations accepted authoritarian control in exchange for the promise of protection. Build the ziggurat high enough, follow the laws precisely enough, give the priests enough power, and maybe the gods won't send the waters again. This pattern played out everywhere. Egypt developed pharaonic god-kings who controlled Nile, flooding through magic. Mesopotamia created elaborate priestly bureaucracies that managed irrigation systems. China developed the concept of the mandate of heaven, where emperors ruled by divine right but could lose that mandate through natural disasters. In every case, the justification was the same. Strong centralized authority protects against catastrophe. Individual freedom matters less than collective survival. The trauma of the flood had created political systems designed to prevent its recurrence. But there's another layer to this, another mystery the flood survivors might explain. The appearance of what archaeologists delicately call advanced technical knowledge in early civilizations. Consider the Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek device from around 100 BCE that tracked astronomical movements with gear ratios and mechanical precision that shouldn't reappear until the 14th century. Or the precision drilling in ancient Egyptian stonework that shows knowledge of geometry and engineering supposedly not formalized until thousands of years later. Or the astronomical alignments built into structures worldwide, from Stonehenge to the pyramids of Giza, that demonstrate sophisticated mathematical understanding. Mainstream archaeology attributes this to genius, to individual innovators who were simply ahead of their time. But there's another possibility, that this knowledge wasn't new, that it was preserved fragments of sophisticated understanding that existed before the flood, carried forward by survivors and their descendants. We know coastal populations before the flood must have developed navigation technologies. You don't survive on coastlines for thousands of years without understanding tides, currents, astronomy. Those same skills translate directly to the astronomical knowledge that shows up in post-flood monuments. We know they must have developed engineering expertise. Coastal settlements require construction techniques that can withstand storms and flooding. That same knowledge explains how post-flood builders could suddenly erect massive stone structures. The flood didn't just kill people, it destroyed the accumulated technical knowledge of thousands of years. But fragments survived, carried in the minds of refugees who became the teachers and priest-kings of the next age. Their knowledge, incomplete and degraded but still far advanced compared to inland hunter-gatherers, would seem almost magical. No wonder they were worshipped. No wonder their descendants claimed divine authority. This brings us to one of the most controversial theories in archaeology, the idea that a lost advanced civilization predated the flood and influenced everything that came after. Academics hate this idea because it's been hijacked by pseudo-scientists claiming aliens or Atlantis. But strip away the nonsense, and there's a real question worth asking. Why does every post-flood civilization seem to start with a golden age? The Egyptians believed their greatest knowledge came from the gods in the distant past. The Mesopotamians claim their cities were founded by divine culture heroes who taught humans the arts of civilization. The Maya had legends of bearded foreigners who brought writing and astronomy. Standard interpretation. These are just origin myths, stories cultures tell themselves. But maybe they're distorted memories of real people from drowned coastal cities who arrived with knowledge that seemed miraculous to hunter-gatherers. Over centuries of retelling, the refugees became gods, their technology became magic, their cities became paradise. We'll never know for certain. The evidence drowned with them. But the pattern is there. The suspicious timing of civilization's emergence, the sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge, the universal flood myths that frame disaster as a turning point in human history. And here's what makes this more than just ancient history. We're living through it again. Global sea levels are rising, not as dramatically as 11,000 years ago, at least not yet, but following the same pattern: warming climate, melting ice, rising oceans. Modern coastal cities from Miami to Mumbai are facing exactly what our ancestors faced. The water is coming. We have advantages they didn't. Technology, early warning systems, the ability to build defences and plan evacuations. But we also have disadvantages. Our coastal cities hold billions of people, not millions. Our civilization depends on complex infrastructure that can't easily move inland. Our political systems struggle to coordinate the massive collective action that survival requires. The flood survivors 11,000 years ago managed to preserve some knowledge, but they lost most of their world. The cities, the libraries if they had them, the accumulated expertise of thousands of years. When climate catastrophe hits civilization, Most of what you've built disappears. We're looking at that same choice now. Do we act decisively while there's still time, or do we wait until the crisis forces action? Our ancestors didn't have that choice. The flood came faster than they could prepare for. We have decades, maybe a century if we're lucky, but we have the same vulnerability they did. We've built our largest, most important cities right where the water will reach them first. We've concentrated our population and our knowledge in exactly the places that will be most affected. We're repeating the same pattern that made the ancient flood so devastating. The difference is, we know the story. It's been preserved in myths and legends for 11,000 years. Our ancestors tried to warn us. They built on high ground. They created flood defences. They developed religions and laws designed to prevent catastrophe. They remembered. The question is whether we're listening, whether we'll learn from their experience before we're forced to live through our own version of the deluge. The waters rose before. The waters are rising again. Civilization survived once, barely, by fleeing inland and rebuilding from fragments. Next time, we might not be so lucky, because next time there's nowhere left to flee to. The world is full now. The highlands are occupied. The resources are claimed. If our coastal cities drown, we can't just show up in someone else's territory and start over. The legacy of the ancient flood isn't just mythology and trauma, it's a warning. Climate catastrophe doesn't destroy just people. It destroys knowledge, technology, the accumulated progress of generations. It forces survivors to start over with almost nothing, and it takes thousands of years to rebuild what was lost in decades. We're the descendants of those survivors. Their genes, their stories, their trauma, all of it lives in us. The fear of floods embedded in our religions, the obsession with building high and strong, the tendency to organize societies around protection against disaster. They survived. They passed on their knowledge, incomplete as it was. They shaped every civilization that came after, but they paid an enormous price. Most of their world died. Most of their knowledge was lost, and they spent the rest of human history trying to prevent it from happening again. Now it's our turn. We face the same rising waters, the same climate shifts, the same choice between action and catastrophe. The difference is, we know how the story ends if we don't act. Because they told us. In every flood myth, every ancient warning, every monument built impossibly high, the water can take everything. The survivors remember. And the legacy of the flood is written not just in ancient stones and myths, but in the choice we face right now. Will we be the generation that finally heeds the warning? Or will our descendants be telling new flood stories 11,000 years from now, wondering why we didn't listen when we had the chance? So here we are, at the end of a journey that started with stories told around ancient fires and ended with modern science confirming what those storytellers knew all along. The flood myths weren't just myths. They were memories, passed down through hundreds of generations, preserving knowledge of the most catastrophic climate event humanity had witnessed since becoming a species. Think about what we've learned. 11,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose over 400 feet in just a few thousand years. Coastal populations that had spent millennia building lives along shorelines watched their entire worlds disappear beneath the waves. Entire landscapes, home to millions of people, vanished underwater. The Persian Gulf flooded. The Black Sea catastrophically filled. Doggerland drowned. Indonesia's vast continental shelf became thousands of scattered islands. And everywhere, in every culture that survived, people remembered. They remembered in Mesopotamia, where Sumerian scribes recorded the story of Utnapishtim surviving a deluge sent by the gods. They remembered in the Mediterranean, where Greek poets told of Deucalion building an ark to escape divine wrath. They remembered in India, where the Matsya Purana described Manu being warned by a fish to prepare for catastrophic flooding. In China, where Yu the Great spent decades controlling the floodwaters. In Australia, where Aboriginal stories describe the rising seas that separated the mainland from Tasmania. In the Americas, where tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon preserved tales of world-drowning waters. These weren't coincidental similar stories. They were accurate historical records, transmitted orally across time spans that make written history look like yesterday's news. For 11,000 years, people who had never developed writing, who had no scientific instruments, who couldn't possibly have known about ice sheets or glacial melt or eustatic sea level rise, preserved the essential truth. The waters came. Everything changed. We survived. That's the real miracle here. Not that the floods happened. We've got the geological evidence for that carved into continental shelves and drowned river valleys. The miracle is that the memory survived. Generation after generation, parent to child, elder to initiate, the stories were told and retold with enough accuracy that we can still recognise the actual events they describe. This tells us something profound about human memory and the power of oral tradition. We've become so dependent on writing, on external records, on Google and Wikipedia and cloud storage, that we've forgotten what the human mind is actually capable of remembering. Our ancestors, the ones who survived the floods and the ones who came after, they couldn't afford to forget. The stories weren't entertainment, they were survival guides. Instructions for what to do when the world starts changing in ways that threaten everything you know. And maybe that's the most important lesson these ancient memories have for us today. Because we're living through another period of rapid climate change. Not as fast as the meltwater pulse events, not yet. But fast enough that coastlines are starting to shift again. Fast enough that weather patterns people have relied on for generations are becoming unpredictable. Fast enough that we need to remember what our ancestors learned the hard way 11,000 years ago. Climate can change catastrophically. When it does, rigid societies collapse, flexible ones adapt and survive. The coast won't stay where it is forever. Building your entire civilization right at sea level is a gamble against geological time. Most importantly, humans are incredibly resilient. The people who watched their homelands flood didn't just give up and die. They adapted. They moved. They built new communities. They preserved their knowledge and passed it on. They survived. And because they survived, we're here. That's their gift to us. Not just the warning encoded in flood myths, but the proof that humans can face existential environmental catastrophe and come through the other side. Our species has survived ice ages and climate reversals and sea level changes that would have wiped out less adaptable creatures. We carry the genes and the cultural inheritance of survivors. When people say humans can't adapt to climate change, they're forgetting that adaptation is literally what we do best. It's what defines us as a species. But adaptation requires knowledge. It requires understanding what's happened before and what's likely to happen next. It requires listening to the warnings, even when they come from unexpected sources. Even when they come from ancient stories that most people dismissed as primitive superstition. The flood myths were real. The catastrophe they describe actually happened. And the people who preserved those memories across 400 generations did us an incredible service. They handed down a map of disaster and survival that we're only now learning to read properly. So if you've made it this far in this journey through deep time and ancient memory, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being curious about the real history hidden in myth. Thank you for taking the time to understand what actually happened when the world flooded and how humanity survived. If you found this exploration valuable, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into ancient mysteries, lost civilizations, and the real history behind the myths we thought we knew. Drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and whether your culture has its own flood tradition. I read every comment and I'm genuinely curious about the global reach of these ancient memories. Coming up, we'll be exploring more mysteries from humanity's deep past. Lost cities, forgotten technologies, and the archaeological evidence that keeps rewriting what we thought we knew about our ancestors. The story of human survival is far stranger and more impressive than we ever imagined. Until then, sleep well. And remember, the stories your ancestors told weren't just stories. They were memories of real events, real catastrophes, real survival. They were, and they still are, lessons worth remembering.